Hi there. This is reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Chapter 17. So in this chapter, there's going to be more about the mountain symbolism and the mountains themselves, including my favorite reflection on this topic, and of course, more exploration of quality, and some problems that Chris is facing. So this chapter begins with the narrator's concern over Chris, who seems to be overtaken with the fear that he may not be able to climb the mountain. Of course, this isn't just the mountain they are climbing for recreation. This is one of many metaphors. It's looking bad for Chris. For a while, he was way ahead of me, and now he sits under a tree and rests. He doesn't look at me, and that's how I know it's bad. I sit down next to him, and his expression is distant. His face is flushed, and I can see he's exhausted. We sit and listen to the wind through the pines. So, true, Chris fears the real mountain, but life itself is beginning to seem insurmountable to the young man. In order to distract him, the narrator tells him kind of an amusing story about the time that Phaedrus and, his former self Phaedrus, and Chris's mother came face to face with a moose, and he has to actually reconstruct. He has had to... This story actually emerged when he was reconstructing Phaedrus's experiences from his notes. The narrator doesn't actually remember the story himself. He also tells Chris how to climb a mountain, which has an in-the-moment quality. Mountains should be climbed with as little effort as possible and without desire. The reality of your own nature should determine the speed. If you become restless, speed up. If you become winded, slow down. You climb the mountain with an equilibrium between restlessness and exhaustion. Then, when you're no longer thinking ahead, each footstep isn't just a means to an end, but a unique event in itself. This leaf has jagged edges. This rock looks loose. From this place, the snow is less visible, even though closer. There are things you should notice anyway. To live only for some future goal is shallow. It's the sides of the mountain which sustain life, not the top. Here's where things grow. So this is sort of quality in action. You could say, as you go in each moment, you realize what's relevant, relevance realization. I guess you could say as quality scales down to what's directly in your immediate experience, and he also uses the word event here. It is a unique event in itself, each footstep, and that's going to become important later. So you've got really just your direct experience, and this is a great description of interacting with the world in the very present, where the only thing that could possibly inform you is what is relevant in front of you, what draws your attention, what is better quality, what is quality. We'll certainly expand on this in later chapters. But of course, without the top, you can't have any sides. It's the top that defines the sides. Mental reflection is much more interesting than TV. It's a shame more people don't switch over to it. They probably think what they hear is unimportant, but it never is. Now, if there's an apt description toward improving one's life for the age of distraction, this is it. Mental reflection, it's contemplation and or meditation and both, and it's something that you can't possibly do if you're constantly looking at Instagram. So then the narrative goes back to the classroom and continuing to try to figure out what is this thing called quality, and the narrator recalls a fragment where Phaedrus asks his class the question directly: what is quality in thought and statement? How are we supposed to know what quality is, they said. You're supposed to tell us. Then he told them he couldn't figure it out either and really wanted to know. He had assigned it in the hope that somebody would come up with a good answer. That ignited it. A roar of indignation shook the room. So there's so much commotion at this kind of tables turning, I guess you could say, that another instructor pops his head in to make sure everything's okay. It's all right, Phaedrus said. We just accidentally stumbled over a genuine question, and the shock is hard to recover from. It's so good. Some students looked curious at this, and the noise simmered down. The fact of the matter is, Feeders really does want to know, and he wants his students' help. And the students, they're obviously angry about this. They're not used to at all a professor who isn't going to tell them what to think. I mean, this isn't the 70s, school without walls or free spirit. No, it's nothing like that. This was happening, I believe, in the 50s. So they just go directly back to needing to know his point of view. Some of the puzzled ones looked at him with a first dawning. He wasn't playing games. He really wanted to know. A most peculiar person. Then someone said, "What do you think?" "I don't know," he answered. "But what do you think?" He paused for a long time. "I think there is such a thing as quality, but as soon as you try to define it, something goes haywire. You can't do it." So everyone gets on board at this point with the unusual project of trying to figure out what is quality. A few days later, he worked up a definition of his own and put it on the blackboard to be copied for posterity. The definition was, quality is a characteristic of thought and statement that is recognized by a non-thinking process. Because definitions are a product of rigid formal thinking, quality cannot be defined. In fact, the fact that this definition was actually a refusal to define did not draw comment. Okay, so remember back when we were talking about climbing the mountain in the immediate moment. So listen to this. The phrase, a characteristic of thought and statement that is recognized by a non-thinking process. What are you doing on the mountain in the moment? You're not thinking. You're seeing what has quality, and you're integrating it. You're reacting to it. So that's going to become a very important way to understand what he's trying to tell us in this book. So quality can't be defined, but it can be perceived. So I think that is the key word. But even though quality cannot be defined, you know what quality is. And the storm started all over again. "Oh, no, we don't. Oh, yes, you do. Oh, no, we don't. Oh, yes, you do." He said he had some material ready to demonstrate it to them. He had selected 2 examples of student composition. The first was a rambling, disconnected thing with interesting ideas, but never built into anything. The second was a magnificent piece by a student who was mystified himself about why it had come out so well. Feeders read both, and then he asked for a show of hands on who thought the first was best. 2 hands went up. He asked how many liked the second better. 28 hands went up. "Whatever it is," he said, that caused the overwhelming majority to raise their hands, for the second one is what I mean by quality, so you know what it is. Then comes the famous exercise where everyone is to rate a few papers for quality and compare the rankings. And surprising, the rankings are almost congruent. Their question now is, all right, we know what quality is. How do we get it? Good point. How do we get it? Now at last, the standard rhetoric texts came into their own. The principles expounded in them were no longer rules to rebel against, not ultimates in themselves, not ultimates in themselves. So pay attention to that. But just techniques, gimmicks for producing what really counted and stood independently of the techniques, quality. What had started out as a heresy from traditional rhetoric turned into a beautiful introduction to it. So this is an interesting point and a very important one. It turns out that quality can't be enforced onto writing rationally to produce a good essay. It has to emerge, it has to emerge from quality, and the framework, the rational framework of the outline and the footnotes gives it coherence, gives this spontaneous generation of quality from a non-thinking process a pattern of intelligibility. A good essay has form nested in quality. Form does not impose quality. And I want to emphasize this passage because this is really how our experience of the world could be structured. We are aware of quality, we become aware of quality, and then we let the rational methods we have learned help us implement it in the world. They are a bridge between our perception of quality and the actual physical reality of the world. So that is a way, for example, in this case of writing, rather than write the way we should according to the rules of rhetoric. Outlines and footnotes are standard things taught in all freshman composition classes, but now as devices for improving quality, they had a purpose. And if a student turned in a bunch of dumb references or a sloppy outline that showed he was just fulfilling an assignment by rote, he could be told that while his paper may have fulfilled the letter of the assignment, he obviously didn't fulfill the goal of quality and was therefore worthless. It obviously didn't fulfill the goal of quality and was therefore worthless. You see it. If he said, no, I don't, he'd be told, yes, you do. He proved it. The student was finally and completely trapped into making quality judgments for himself. And it was just exactly this and nothing else that taught him how to write. So by imposing a form onto quality, creativity is destroyed. However, when the rule is reversed, when form assists in making quality intelligible, creativity can run wild and then be kind of, I guess you could say, edited, pared, scaled down so it can be shared with the world. By reversing a basic rule that all things which are to be taught must first be defined, he had found a way out of all this. He was pointing to no principle, no rule of good writing, no theory, but he was pointing to something, nevertheless, that was very real, whose reality they couldn't deny. The vacuum, remember last chapter, that had been created by the withholding of grades was suddenly filled with the positive goal of quality. And the whole thing fit together. And that's how Friedrich's students gained agency in their writing. And as we know, agency in the arena is key to positive emotion, to meaning, to flow, to a positive state of mind. And these students started to love this class. And that was more notable for the ones who really hated it, obviously. As for Friedrich, he didn't have any idea what he was doing. He just knew it worked. In time, however, he wondered why it worked, especially when he already knew it was irrational. Why should an irrational method work when rational methods were all so rotten? He had an intuitive feeling growing rapidly that what he had stumbled on was no small gimmick. It went far beyond. How far, he didn't know. It was the beginning of the crystallization that I talked about before. Yes, this is just the beginning. And he was also beginning to see the underlying structure to be able to implement quality in all facets of life. But that has, major implications, and we've already touched on a lot of that. If anyone else had asked, what is quality? It would have been just another question. But when he asked, because of his past, it spread out for him like waves in all directions simultaneously, not in a hierarchic structure, but in a concentric one. Kind of reminds me of Pajot. At the center, generating the waves, was quality. As these waves of thought expanded for him, I'm sure he fully expected each wave to reach some shore of existing patterns of thought, so that he had a kind of unified relationship with all these thought structures. But the shore was never reached until the end, if it appeared at all. For him, there was nothing but ever-expanding waves of crystallization. A lot of this is going to be, as you know, worked out in Lila, and I do like to point out to places in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance which are going to influence, which are going to really cohere in Lila, and this passage is one of them. So back to Chris, who's having a hell of a time climbing the mountain, angry and clumsy. The trouble is, in YMCA camp, they indoctrinated him with the idea that being a rugged outdoorsman is a status thing, and you had to prove yourself with badges and overcoming weakness and rising up the hierarchy. You can get the badges, but does this really give you the inner strength? Are you better prepared as a person in the world for receiving a badge? Have you developed a sense of meaning that will carry you through future struggles? It made all the kids at the camp much more enthusiastic and cooperative when they had ego goals to fulfill, I'm sure, but ultimately that kind of motivation is destructive. Any effort that has self-glorification as its final endpoint is bound to end in disaster. Now we're paying the price. When you try to climb a mountain to prove how big you are, you almost never make it. If you've got a kid who has let's just say, some emotional issues to begin with, this probably really is sort of an exacerbating thing rather than a utility, this YMCA experience. So that brings on a whole other set of things to think about, but we're not going to do it here. I mean, like, what is the best way? What is the best way to prepare a child for the world? So we could think about that. And how does the narrator know that this kind of motivation is destructive? When you climb a mountain to prove how big you are, you almost never make it. How does he know this? Well, the reason he knows it is he's been through it. When Phaedrus was in India, he went on a pilgrimage to climb the holy Mount Kailas in the Himalayas, and he had ended up giving up because while he had good physical strength, he had just gotten out of the army, and the intellectual desire for understanding Eastern culture and self-improvement and all that stuff, he lacked the participatory and perspectival knowledge of what the pilgrimage really meant. And what the pilgrimage really meant is that it was a holy process. And in that case, each step was holy. He didn't think he had been arrogant, but thought that he was undertaking the pilgrimage to broaden his experience, to gain understanding for himself. He was trying to use the mountain for his own purposes and the pilgrimage too. He regarded himself as the fixed entity, not the pilgrimage or the mountain, and thus wasn't ready for it. Ego. Ego without arrogance, but still ego. And so what he lacked was this sense of holiness. It was the holiness that infused the pilgrims with so much meaning and took them out of themselves. They were participating in the mountain. And the obstacles of endurance and discomfort weren't even in the equation for them. Think about Viktor Frankl. The people in the concentration camp who believed they had something to live for raised their chances of survival. They got through it. In the physical world, climbing a mountain is just climbing a mountain. So if you were to look at the holy pilgrimage and look at some guy climbing a mountain so he could say he got to the top, they'd look the same. But the two approaches have nothing in common. One approach is an everyday world egoistic pursuit, and the other has real world meaning. You can see I'm using John Vervaeke's useful terminology more and more to describe some of these phenomena. So the ego climber does not unite in harmony with the climb. He stumbles, he gets frustrated. I want enlightenment now. He's here, but he's not. This is about Chris. He's here, but he's not here. He rejects the here. He's unhappy with it, wants to be farther up the trail, but when he gets there, he's just as unhappy because then it will be here. What he's looking for, what he wants, is all around him, but he doesn't want that because it is all around him. Every step's an effort, both physically and spiritually, because he imagines his goal to be external and distant. That seems to be Chris's problem now. Dukkha. So Chris, I guess, has some spiritual problem? Perhaps. And does this not reflect something we too experience when we think our entire existence and meaning is contingent on how effectively we control our surroundings? Spiritual freedom is an embodied acceptance of these limitations and going with them instead of against them. Freedom is the ability to find quality in the most challenging of situations because quality is always there. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next Sunday for Chapter 18.